My name is Mark Millington, and the word I'm going to talk about is machismo, which is spelt M-A-C-H-I-S-M-O. Perhaps it's worth saying something to begin with just about pronunciation. The word machismo comes from Spanish, and in Spanish the pronunciation would be machismo. The word's been adopted into English, and one will hear different pronunciations. Most people say machismo, but one or two people will say machismo. I'm not sure where the pronunciation machismo comes from, but it is something that one will hear, and given that it's understood by everybody, I guess that's fine. If we look at the word in Spanish, which will help us to understand it, it's derived from the word macho, which is the word which is used to identify a male animal. Now, machismo is a concept which develops out of the idea of the macho, the male, and it basically describes a form of behaviour. Now, the interesting thing is that in adopting the word into English, we use a narrower range of meaning than exists in Spanish. So in Spanish, the term has a richer number of connotations, and depending on the context, it will be understood in different ways. In English, our use of the term is, as I say, narrower. So I thought it would be interesting to start by talking about the narrow overlap and then look at the broader sense of the term in Spanish. Where there's an overlap, we're talking about a form of behaviour which is to do with aggression, to do with dominance, to do with sense of physical superiority. At some point, even violence, a sense of physical dominance to that extent. It also has to do with attitudes towards others. And here I think it's important that the sexual dimension of the behaviour comes into focus, because frequently machismo is a way in which certain kinds of men behave towards women, and this is where the idea of superiority and dominance becomes really important. That macho behaviour is about the denigration of women and femininity. Macho behaviour would look upon femininity as weakness, as suggesting vulnerability, softness, and therefore by contrast, someone who displays macho behaviour would be strong, perhaps assume a kind of invulnerability, would certainly not want to admit to any weakness or softness. By that contrast between femininity and masculinity in this context, you can come to understand what the key characteristics of machismo are. There's also an important strand in it which is to do with homophobia, so that gay men would be looked down upon, an attitude adopted towards them of dominance just as it is adopted towards women. Perhaps another final aspect here would be, along with this emphasis on dominance, superiority, aggression, is a downplaying of emotion, perhaps a difficulty in dealing with emotional situations or emotional understanding. So emotional intelligence would be downplayed as something which is significant. So all these features, I suppose one might look upon as negative in terms of social behaviour and social integration. But as I said to begin with, there's another range of meanings in Spanish which one can see is related to some of the features I've suggested, but which would get a much more positive assessment. So here we would be thinking about features to do with bravery, strength, integrity, the importance of honour, in other words, preserving one's reputation, being seen to be morally sound, someone who would be reliable in standing up and protecting those for whom responsibility was held. Perhaps also by extension too, someone who was emotionally warm and even emotionally expressive, which seems a world apart from some of the features that I mentioned earlier on. But in this in these positive contexts, that kind of feature would also be essential to the definition of the term. So in the Spanish context, we've got a potential for a positive connotation. In other contexts, perhaps a more negative connotation. I think you'd say that machismo is a form of behaviour which is universal. In other words, it manifests itself in all sorts of cultures and in all sorts of societies. The interesting thing is that the term comes from Spanish, the Spanish-speaking world, and therefore I think you'd have to conclude that this kind of behaviour was more prevalent, more visible in that kind of context than in other contexts. But clearly we recognise the kind of behaviour, particularly the negative kind of behaviour that I've been talking about. So it's interesting that in the English-speaking world we've adopted the word with its negative connotations rather than the more positive ones. We need a word to describe this behaviour. The Spanish-speaking world has a word for it, so we've adopted it, and it functions perfectly well for us. We recognise that behaviour. It's interesting that we haven't got the positive connotations as well, and there might be some interesting sociological work to do to explore why those connotations haven't translated as well. But we are where we are.